Good morning and welcome. My name is Ileana Mora, and I am the president and CEO of Women Employed, an organization based here in Chicago that works toward the economic advancement of women and their families. It's a pleasure for me to be here today with this panel and the opportunity to introduce them. Today, we will be discussing unpaid work, pay equity, and the challenges faced in the modern workplace. We will also explore how existing structures perpetuate gender inequality in the workplace and hear what formal policies can do to bridge that gender gap. Women make up about half of the global working age population, but participate in the labor force on an unequal basis. 75% of men and only 50% of women work globally, a 24% gap. On average, worldwide, women earn 2/3 of what men earn and spend at least twice as much time on unpaid work. Women who are in the minority in those countries, the wage gap is even greater. Men and women alike report that one of the greatest challenges is the responsibility of managing work and family. Redefining work from the physical environment to company culture, and by introducing policies that promote parental leave and flexible arrangements should be a priority for all organizations worldwide. I often think to myself at the end of the night as I lay in bed and look at the ceiling and have had a full day, talk to the teacher, made sure my children brushed their teeth, make sure they ate, make sure they did their homework, make sure I had their lunches packed, as I sit there and think, oh my God, surely a woman did not design this work environment. I think of that often. And so I am thrilled to be here today to introduce the panel, starting with Liz Gray. Liz is the president of the Equation at the Female Quotient, an organization that works with corporations to advance diversity and gender equality in the workplace. Previously, she was a trend analyst at CAA, focusing on the attitudes of Gen X and Gen Y, and has worked in partnership deals with clients including ESPN, HBO, Nike, among others. Matt Krentz is the senior partner and managing director at the Boston Consulting Group, where he leads the firm's global people team and serves on the executive and operating committees of the Boston Consulting Group. He leads the Women at BCG program designed to empower female employees at the Boston Consulting Group. Josh Levs is the leading expert on the challenges facing modern fathers in the workplace. And over the span of 20 years, he has enjoyed an award-winning career in journalism at NPR and CNN. He is also the author of a book called All In. He made news by taking legal action against Time Warner and writes about this in his book, For Fair Parental Leave. And as a result, corporations around the world took notice and began to implement changes for paternity leave policies. Dr. Alaa Murabit is a physician and the executive director of Phase -1, an inclusive security firm. She is also an advisor to numerous international organizations and governments, most notably as a global sustainable development goals advocate, and as a UN high-level commissioner on health, employment, and economic growth. She was recently named 2017 Forbes 30 Under 30. And founded Voices of Libyan Women, an organization which champions women's political participation and economic empowerment in Libya. She also serves on the board of directors for Malala Fund. And lastly, our distinguished moderator, Niev King, who is the vice president for programs and strategic content at the Chicago Global of Council Affairs. Following the panel, there will be more of that fun technology where you can submit your questions. And without further ado, let's get the show on the road.
Thanks, Ileana. Good morning, everybody. I'm delighted that you're all here. We're here now to talk about the off-ramp. We've heard a good bit of jargon this morning, and we're going to demystify this. We heard about golden skirts, bamboo ceilings. It's hard. Pink washing. We're not pink washing today, as you can see. We've got the right representation. And so I think we'll kick it off. Alaa, I just had a brief conversation with her in the green room. She explained to me that she's a Libyan North American with free healthcare. She's from Saskatchewan and just came back from the UNGA, where she was involved in some important meetings, and just kind of hear from her at the 35,000-foot level how we can empower women and prioritize economic rights and participation.
Thank you guys for having me. I'm always excited to coming to anything from the Chicago Council, mainly because you guys employ lots of Canadians, which I appreciate. Slowly taking over North America. So here's the thing. I think this conversation, and I'm so glad to be on this panel because it is so diverse in idea and in experience, but this conversation is twofold. There's the conversation that you're having in developed countries, which is a lot more about retention and about how do we keep women in the buildings and how do we get them to the table. But I think the larger conversation that we're kind of underestimating its importance is in the developing world. Is the fact that in the vast majority of the world, women are working. I mean, our data, and I'm a data nerd, but our data does not show the fact that women are working incredibly hard. They're arguably working twice as hard and twice as long as anybody else, but the difference is it's unpaid labor. It's not seen we don't get to see it, and oftentimes it's not measured in our GDP and things like that. So the best kind of story I'll give on this is Lema Gbowee, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for her work in Liberia, was going into a room with male leaders from a community. And she was telling them, we need to support women's economic growth. We need to give them more resources. This needs to happen. And one of the men said, well, what do they do? My wife's at home. What does she do all day? Why would we do that? We do all the work. And so Lema got him to write, starting in the morning, the actual amount per activity. So from making breakfast for the family, to getting the kids ready, to doing the work on the farm, to even, as she says, how she pleasures him at night. And to add all of that up, and it amounted to much more than the man made. So the reality is if we're actually calculating how much women should be making, we'd be having a very different conversation. Now, when we talk about economic growth as it relates, and the panel before did a wonderful job of kind of outlining the importance of health and maternal and neonatal and infant health, because they're very connected issues. If we were to educate girls equally, if you were to educate them equally and employ women equally, we'd have a greater economic growth than China and India combined. That's not a small number. We're talking about the education of girls. You're looking at a 10% increase of educated girls in a country. That's a 2 to 3% GDP increase. If you're talking about the education of girls and the employment of women, you're talking about having less children. You're talking about having vaccinated children, healthier children. So it's a very cyclical situation where if we start somewhere, if we just start somewhere, and if we're talking about women's employment, then we need to be starting a lot sooner than when they enter the workforce. We need to be starting when they're in school. We need to be talking to young girls when they are in collected places and saying, listen, not only do you have a right to school, but you have a right to the skill set that's necessary in your community. That might not be one that we think is necessary here in Chicago or in New York. The last thing I'll add to this is, I don't know how many of you have read Paul Hawken's Drawdown, which is a wonderful book. It's right now the most comprehensive book on climate change solutions. And his number one solution, 5 and 6 separately, but number one together, is women's reproductive rights and girls' education. That is our most cost-effective, practical solution for climate change. So this is a much larger conversation than just what is the bottom line and how do we engage women. It's a much larger conversation about, are we being realistic about the Sustainable Development Goals, which say that we're going to eradicate poverty, which affects women more, that say that we're going to have every child have a quality education, every child get access to healthcare, we're going to have economic growth, we're going to have peace, justice, and strong institutions. In order for us to realistically do that, we're not only talking about investing in women and investing in women's capital, we're also talking about restructuring our entire global economic system, to say that unpaid work should not be unpaid, that it is relevant, and to say that there needs to be a greater focus on supplying women not only with microfinancing or small resources or small investments, but more so with things like land and capital and political influence and economic leverage, so that they can actually take that on in a more sustainable manner.
Thanks, Alaa. Matt, we'll move over to you. You just did a great report at BCG on gender and ambition. And from what I understand, how you've been implementing that work at BCG has been terrific. What specific policies do you think, what practices and structures are actually, proving the most effective way to pave women from coming in at the same level as men, but then getting up the leadership ladder?
So also, thank you for having me. I enjoy being here. It's interesting. We've had statistics that talk about, Fortune 500 companies and how many of the leaders or CEOs are women, and the number seems stuck at, a very low 5%-ish level. And that hasn't changed for years, despite lots of dialogue and discussion. And in fact, if you looked at the S&P 1500, there are more CEOs named John than there are women. And the interesting part is when you go talk to companies and research we've done, and you ask men and women senior leaders, and most of the senior leaders are men, the first answer they come to when they say, how are you advancing women in your organization, is they say, recruiting. We're trying to recruit more women. When you talk to women, the point you raised is it's not about recruiting. It's about how do I actually retain, and more importantly, how do I advance in the organization? And when we asked people in companies that were seen as doing well, that the men and women in the companies believed they were engaged on advancing women in leadership, the ambition gap was non-existent. And women in their 30s, 40s were as ambitious as men, and it didn't matter whether they had families, whether they were married, whether they were not married, it was the same. Interestingly enough, in most companies, 3/4 of companies, that is not true. And there is a 17-point difference in ambition and seeing a pathway forward. So then your question comes, so what do you do about that, and why does it arise? And let me talk briefly just maybe about retention at one level and then advancement. On the retention side, the most powerful thing we see is addressing the ways we work. And that means addressing flex policies, maternity, paternity leave, leave of absences, ways to actually manage your career over time. And most importantly, what we see is not that these are programs designed for women, but these are programs that are designed for all your employees, men and women. And importantly, what we've seen as we've introduced flex time work models or flex things, where we have men taking those up, especially men senior leaders, you see greater advancement for women. When it's not a special program that is meant to correct something or overcome something, but it becomes the way you work as an organization. And I think challenging the assumptions about how we work, why we work the way we do, how we value what employees do, and fundamentally how you support all your employees in taking maternity and paternity leave, and making it sustainable. So that's on a retention standpoint, that's around how do you keep people engaged in the workforce. That doesn't get people promoted. We have lots of women who work, but they aren't advancing to the more senior levels. And that's where I think I'd say three things. First and foremost, I will use the word sponsorship. And I, on purpose, did not use the word mentorship. Many companies put in mentoring programs. Mentoring means, well, I'm assigned to you and I'm supposed to help you think about your career. That doesn't actually advance somebody. It's helpful, they're good. Sponsorship actually is a deeper commitment. Sponsorship is, I'm not only committed to helping you think about your career, I'm committed to making you have a career that advances. And we need to hold our leaders responsible for sponsorship, not assigning mentorship. The second, there's a lot of talk about bias training. I think there's a place for unconscious bias training. We all bring it. We all have different things that we bring from our growing up, our beliefs, etc. The problem is companies often stop there. They feel if they've rolled out a program that they've checked the box. And actually, when we survey and look at employees, one of the things that is most frequently implemented, but also seen as having the least impact, are those training programs where you go spend a day. What you need to actually do is take those things and embed them actually in your core processes. So how are evaluations actually done? And look for what is the language, the words, the way they're done. How do you actually look at promotion slates? Do you make sure that they are diverse and require diversity in the slates that come up for new nominations? And fundamentally embed that through the processes, not just in a 1-day or 2-day training that I do annually. And then the last part, which I think becomes very, very important for women, is role models. And we don't have enough of them by definition. We've also observed is that often women are looking for the role model, the person that has done it the way they think they can do it. Men are much more willing to kind of pick and choose. I like what that person does, I kind of don't like that aspect, and then I pull together what it is that's my role model. As a result, with fewer senior women leaders, there's not as much opportunity to do that. And often companies not only need to amplify and make visible the role models who have succeeded and how they progressed through their careers and the trade-offs they made, you also need to look outside. And that's where I think affinity groups, things like this actually help, because it's finding somebody you can connect to. But I'd also encourage you, if you're a woman advancing your career, there is no perfect role model. You have to find the way that you're going to make that trade-off. And being able and knowing that as a male senior leader, and how do I start to engage and help people understand the way they may choose to map their career will be different, but that they also need to make sure they're aware of that when they interact with younger and new employees.
Is the role modeling related to the sponsorship, Matt, or it doesn't have to be?
No, it doesn't have to be. I mean, I think you can find role models that you learn from or that you take lessons from. Sponsorship is much more active. You have to be engaged with the problems the individual is struggling with. You have to actually take a voice at the leadership table to advocate. And to me, advocating for them when the promotion comes, helping them actually create the opportunity. And that could be your role model, but absolutely doesn't have to be.
Somebody at the table to make sure you're not on the menu, as they mentioned earlier today. Liz, love to move over to you. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your organization, but also you work in how we actually take the world that Matt's talking about, and how does it look in a space? How do you make it? We hear about bean bags in companies. It's supposed to be really a great way to work around lots of bean bags. How does this really work with setting up a space that promotes these kind of policies?
Okay, so to answer your first question, the female quotient, we are in the business of equality. The community piece of our business is the Girls Lounge. Some of you might be familiar with it. It is a destination for the small percentage of women who are at a lot of corporate events, anything from CES to Davos, the World Economic Forum. And it's become a community of thousands of working women who come together either virtually or in real world at these conventions to collaborate and talk about important subjects and then go back and advance the change within their groups. I run the Equation, which is the strategy arm of the female quotient, and I am fortunate enough to work with clients both internally and on their outward-facing messages on how we really advance equality. And Matt, I echo everything that you said. He stole actually a lot of my thunder, but I agree. I think it's one thing to put courses in place. We know what needs to be done, and I think what's always shocking to me, especially when we hear stats like 1 in 4 people think that we'll be able to time travel, like Back to the Future time travel, before we reach equality in the workplace. It's amazing to me that we're still so pessimistic. So I think we're at a point now where it's great that companies like me come in and we run unconscious bias training. We find you the technology you need to, create systems. But really what we need is firm accountability and intentional leadership. And I think intentional leadership, it has to start from the top. There has to be accountability at every single level in order for us really to stop talking about it and start pushing it forward. because it can't just stop at a day training or, a mentoring program that people can just choose to participate in. But we've also, with our work, a holistic approach is important. We have to be looking at social stigmas, cultural norms. The way we're living has completely changed from when traditional business structures were put in place. So I think the three things it comes down to is corporate culture has to be completely disruptive, to be more reflective of the fluid lives that we're living. I think that we're living in a value economy right now, and employees need to understand their part of the value system of whatever company they're a part of. And then lastly, flexibility. I think it's time to rebrand flexibility completely to be more of a strategic tool. And I'm not just talking about flex plans, for new parents. I'm talking about, looking at companies like Amazon that are running pilots for 30-hour work weeks, being flexible about nonlinear careers. Really, flexibility is a much bigger tool than just hours in the office.
Great, thanks very much, Liz. Josh, over to you on the topic of paternity leave. So your timing's great. Jeff Zuckerberg, Mark, yeah, thank you. Mark Zuckerberg went back to work.
He didn't do very much. His name's not very relevant. I don't.
Went back to work this week after his parental leave, although somebody kindly pointed out he now has more women in his house than on his board. So hopefully he gets some flack for that when he's back in the office. You talk about changing policies that were designed for the madman era, the martini lunch, the assistants crawling all over you. Talk a little bit about your work on this.
It's so funny. Every time Mark Zuckerberg takes paternity leave, all the media call me for a comment. It's like he's one dad in San Francisco.
He got you before that, though.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I flew in late from Atlanta. It is great to be here. Thank you. And also, I know you've been sitting still for a while. Totally appreciate that you're all listening. Hope you have enough coffee. So let me just tell you first the big picture, okay? I work on the secret, unknown other half of what it is to make gender equality finally happen. Very few people know this. But the fact is that the biggest unknown force preventing gender equality in businesses all over the world is this incredibly strong set of structures against men as equal caregivers. We have a system of laws, policies, and stigmas that make it much, much tougher for men to be equal caregivers at home. And until we create structures that allow and encourage men to be equal caregivers at home, we won't be able to solve any of this stuff. So let me tell you a little bit about me and how I got into this and why paternity leave is so important. My background is that I'm a journalist. I spent 10 years on NPR and then 10 years at CNN. One of the big things I did on CNN was that I was a fact checker on the air, always trying to jump in after politicians would speak and pundits and others and come in with the facts. And at the same time, I became a dad. So I took that fact-checking lens and started reporting on modern parenthood and started to discover how incredibly many things that people think are facts are actually not facts, and how incredibly many numbers in the news are actually inaccurate. And one of the biggest sets of misconceptions I found is about the modern family, about mothers and fathers. So here I was reporting about this on the air, and then I became the dad in the news because when my wife was pregnant with our third child, we realized that I would be needed at home to do caregiving after our daughter was born. Now, I knew from my reporting that that's totally normal. Dads do this. Dads can be caregivers now. Unfortunately, the world's policies have not caught up with that. So the structures I was under at CNN, it was an interesting mistake there because you said Jeff Zucker by mistake, who was briefly my boss at CNN. But the structures that I was under at Time Warner allowed anyone to get 10 paid weeks after having a child, except a guy who got his own wife pregnant. Anybody could get 10 paid weeks except a man in a traditional scenario. So if I had a same-sex domestic partner who adopted a baby, I didn't have to adopt the baby. I could still get 10 paid weeks. Anyone, and I support that, but it was anyone except a traditional dad. So I went to HR totally in secret. And I said, come on, this has got to be an oversight. There's no way you meant to give everybody this option except... and they said, oh, that's so interesting. Put it in writing. So then I did, but then months went by with no answer. And then my daughter was born prematurely in an emergency. And my wife was really sick. I'm messaging from the hospital room. Still no answer. And then 11 days later, I'm home holding my 4-pound preemie, caring for my very sick wife and my 2 boys. And that's when Time Warner said, no, you cannot have that 10 paid weeks that anybody else would get. I could only get 2 paid weeks. Anybody else could get 10 paid weeks. So the short version is that I launched legal action. It got all this attention, front page of the New York Times, all this stuff. Time Warner ended up deciding, the company, the part that I was under, so CNN, Turner, to revolutionize their policies. And in doing so, made it much better for men and women. And companies all over the world responded to that. And my book came out about all this. And now I work with companies all over the world to fix this. And the big piece of this that so many people don't understand is that if men can't stay home to take care of the baby, if men can't be treated equally as caregivers, then women don't have that option. So it doesn't matter how confident you are in the workplace or how much you try or how much you be there, how much you show up. If you have a child or anyone that needs caregiving and you are expected to do it based on your gender, you will not have equal opportunities. And what I found as I look around the country, as I look around the world, is that this is where all this comes from. Why are we the only nation with no paid maternity leave? Because of that same sexism. The thinking is she's a woman. She's supposed to stay home and make no money while the man stays at work and makes the money. So all of these things fit together. And as I've done my global research, I've found that it's the same thing. There are laws and policies and stigmas that push against men as equal caregivers. This is what we have to tackle. So this is why when you ask about paternity leave, this is why it's so important. Paternity leave is a critical women's rights issue. Today's young women are savvy enough in many cases to know that they want to work for companies that have equal paternity leave, because that's a place that truly wants to make sure that women have equal opportunity in the workplace.
Thanks, Josh.
And I would argue that it should be mandatory.
Sorry, did you want to add something, Liz?
I was just going to say that I would argue that it should be mandatory because, again, it goes back to the social stigmas that men won't take it.
Yeah, there was a piece a couple of days ago. I think David Cameron in the UK put in this for men, and only like 8% of men availed of it or something because of the cultural stigma, which we'll get to in a sec.
You get fired if you take it, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Alaa, getting back to you, somebody mentioned Rwanda earlier this morning, which is like this shining star in Africa of women's participation. Can you talk to us a little bit about that, or if you want to use a different example about around the world where we do see in the global south where women are getting ahead?
Well, I think there's a lot of great examples in terms of women's political participation, a lot more than in the developed world, where you see women's political participation, or in, for example, Bangladesh, you'll see women's security participation. They're leading in militaries, they're leading in conflict resolution, et cetera. So we see that. That's not foreign. I think what Rwanda's done differently is Rwanda was rebuilt. It's a lot easier to completely build something up from the ground than it is to come and move little structures around. Anybody who's worked on trying to put in, new internet systems or new transportation systems knows that. In order for you to close something down and take the time to restructure it, you have to get a lot of buy-in, whereas if you're building it up new, it's a lot easier. I am going to go back to a couple of things that were said actually that I think were very important. The first is I'm incredibly proud of the work you're doing, and I think it's great, but how interesting is it that it took one man talking about paternity for something to change when women have been talking about paid maternity leave for a very long time? I think the very nature of it just is mind-boggling, and it hits on something you said about men having the ability to pick role models. Men have the ability because there's 100 dudes at the round table, right? Whereas me, every single room I walked into, I started my work when I was 21 on advising the Security Council. I never once saw a woman who looked like me. I didn't even get the chance to pick a role model. I had to learn to be my own. So I think we really have to recognize that this isn't a, women aren't picking, or women aren't trying hard enough, or women aren't doing. The person who gives the message is different. Having you talk about women's equality in many rooms is more legitimate than having me talk about it, which is mind-boggling. Because in any other room, if I came in and started talking about paternity leave, people would be like, well, what do you know about it, right? So I think we have to be very cognizant that women are trying, women are doing, and the reason they are pessimistic, the reason 1 in 4 people think that time travel will happen before equality is because we've been working a very long time, and there are particular segments of the population that are still getting paid half of what a man gets paid based on their race or their socioeconomic status or how they look or what their name is. So, I think I can sum it all up by saying we should all just change our names to John and we just get much farther ahead.
Exactly. Yeah, John, you want to jump
I
in?
just want to jump in on that really quick because you're absolutely right. So first of all, the idea that I have a voice about issues that women have spoken about for so long is preposterous, and that's why I use my voice, because people have to hear this message. But it actually goes even beyond that. Most of what I do now is speak to women's organizations around the country, around the world, inside businesses, and very often women tell me that it's a paradigm shift for them because there's never been a fact checker in the fatherhood space before. And there's all these examples in my book of men who went to work. This one guy had a baby in an emergency. He was crying at work. It was awful, but everything worked out okay. He took off 2 days. He came back. His boss called him in and rebuked him. How dare you take off so much time? Don't you know you're needed around here? And that boss was a pregnant woman. And there are also experiences around the world that you find in which women are especially concerned that no one find out how involved their husbands are at home because it will look bad for them. And it will look bad in front of other women. So this, in terms of what I'm fighting, this is not just about men versus women. In fact, it isn't really. It's about everyone who gets the modern reality that you were talking about, stigma-free, against the minority that don't, and overcoming those stigmas together. So yeah, there are a lot of men who need to be educated about this, it's true, but there are more and more men who are ready to, and we all need to work to get men and women past these backward stigmas.
And the only thing I would say is the generation that's entering the workforce now in developed countries, in the US, has grown up in a very different environment than our leaders have. So the number of men and women going into the workforce who had dual working parents is significantly different today. Whereas if you looked at men over 40, none of them had mothers that worked. And so the disconnect around what we need to do from senior leaders to those that we're hiring today, and the expectations of those we're hiring, because I do think the expectations are different, and it does require the engagement of both men and women.
Liz, you worked on Gen X, Gen Y stuff. Do you want to pop a quick comment in on that?
Well, and we've done a lot of work recently about this is the first time ever we've had 4 generations in the workforce. So we're talking about Gen Z, millennials, Xers, boomers, are all in the workforce. And when I talk about intentional leadership, it has to be intentional of these boomers and Xers to pull Zs and millennials into these conversations, to intentionally, it's like muscles that have to be practiced every day. They have to be given platforms. Their opinions, have to matter. One of the interviews we did was with Angela Guy, who's the head of diversity and inclusion at L'Oreal. And the way I think this idea of inside out is extremely important right now. Everything that L'Oreal does internally is reflective of the consumer base, the broad consumer base that they're trying to reach. So if one consumer they're trying to reach is not represented and really have a voice at the table, they feel like they're not succeeding. And I think that mentality and putting systems and programs in place to reflect that mentality. But I would agree with you that I feel very optimistic when I speak to Gen Zs and even younger millennials, because they are going to fight. For what they want, and they're pushing against all traditional, demographic profiling. So I'm hopeful.
John, Alaa.
So as the token millennial on the panel, here's the thing, and I'm actually seeing this question in front of us. Do you believe young workers today have a better work-life balance? I don't. I'm going to put my vote in. But one thing I will say to that I think is important is we are so often talking about kind of the social constructs around women's engagement and women's leadership and men's leadership, et cetera. When we're in kindergarten, boys and girls are equally believe they could be president or prime minister or head of state or a CEO. And that plummets to when they're teenagers to less than 13% of girls right now. That's a current number. So it's not really about just the workplace. I mean, yes, we need to go in the workplace and we need to shuffle it up, but we need to start this conversation way younger. What is happening between the age of 5 and 15 that is telling girls that they are not equipped, that they are not leaders, that they are not capable, and people shouldn't listen to them? Because I agree with you. I do think our generations are a lot more willing to step up to the plate, but there still is that social construct that even if a man takes paternity leave, another man takes his spot. You don't get to progress as the woman. You still, so I think we need to be very frank in saying we need to talk to our younger generation. And I think there is a growing swell of young women who are saying, listen, if you don't give me the spot, don't worry about it, I'll take it. Like, I'll do a better job than you and I'll take it and I'll get there. But we need we need to start this conversation off much younger. We need to be in high schools and in middle schools and saying, what is it that we can do to facilitate, to sponsor your growth as young women so that you want to enter the STEM field, or you want to enter business, or you want to enter politics, or you want to enter fields that have significant political, economic, and social decision-making power.
Okay, I want to take a question from the audience, if you don't mind, please, because we only have 6 minutes left. Why hasn't pay discrimination legislation worked?
Because,
Josh, you want to take that?
yeah, I mean, I'm happy to, unless like anyone is an activist specifically on that. Okay, here's what I can tell you, because I have a...
Talk into the mic
So
if you don't
when,
mind.
when you look at the pay discrimination, first of all, unfortunately, that is a topic in which people are at each other's throats, insisting it does exist or it doesn't exist, and very few people are working on it with the same facts. You know, the fact is that there is pay discrimination. It does exist, but some people are able to look at studies and say, well, when you see this and you try to equate for absolutely everything, men and women are paid the same. And what that does is it removes the fact that women have so many more structures in their way, barriers in their way toward getting that same job as the man. Correct. So the biggest thing that's preventing us, I believe, from really achieving equality on that front is that people aren't working with the same facts. The argument can no longer be women are paid 22 cents less per dollar for the same job, because they're not, if it's the exact same job. The problem is women can't get the exact same job. You know, yes, there is that differential anyway, but that misses the point. We're feeding the backward narrative that some people try to have, where they say, oh, women are just not trying. Women aren't going for the same job. No, they are trying, and they're not able to get it. So what we have to do is focus on the barriers that are preventing women from getting to that same spot. Making sure they're paid the exact same amount for the exact same job will do nothing to make sure they have an equal shot at getting the same job.
And that's why the focus on advancement is so critical.
Right.
And what is it that's keeping us from advancing women at the same rates as we do men, and being able to change that? And because otherwise you won't solve the wage gap problem.
And I think there's a certain degree of it too that